Why are we here? What's life all about? Is God really real? Or is there some doubt? Well, tonight we're going to sort it all out. For tonight, it's the meaning of life.
Hello YouTube. This is going to be a relatively short video. I'll be exploring the part of Genesis which covers from what happened just after the flood up until the time when Abram, later known as Abraham, appears. And as always, I'll be citing my verses from the King James Bible Online.org, and I will be posting links to all my sources in the low bar. So, in Genesis chapter 8 verse 15, where we left off, God commands Noah and his family to disembark from the ark and be fruitful and multiply. Noah sacrifices some of all the clean animals as a burnt offering, and God promises to never flood the earth again. This sounds somewhat similar to the ending of the story of Atrahasis. In that story, the man who had survived the flood also presented burnt offerings to the gods, who were apparently very hungry from having gone without sacrifices. And even though it's not stated directly, one does get the sense that such a flood would never happen like that again. At the beginning of Genesis chapter 9, God tells Noah and his family once again to be fruitful and multiply, and that the fear of humans will be in all beasts, which suggests that humans were not meat eaters before this, even though there were pastoralists like Abel before this that collected sheep into herds and looked after them. And there was already a difference between clean and unclean beasts, like 2 chapters before this, which would not have mattered very much if humans did not eat animals at all. The concept of clean and unclean beasts is never really explained in Genesis. It is, however, explained more in depth in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and I think that's where it comes from. This makes me think that an author from the 7th and through the 5th centuries BC wrote or rewrote this part of Genesis, because Leviticus was written during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, and Deuteronomy was written before that, around the 7th century BC. And here in this part of Genesis, we also get a reference to the rule against drinking blood, which also appears in Leviticus chapter 17. In fact, Genesis chapter 9 verse 4 sounds almost identical to the first part of Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11. So God finishes his covenant by giving a sign that he'll never again try to destroy the world by flood, and the sign he gives is a rainbow. According to the Atrahasis story, the great goddess Nintu swears to remember the flood by the beads in her necklace, which some have likened to a rainbow. So, Noah settles down and plants a vineyard, and winds up getting drunk off his own wine. Ham discovers him naked in his tent and tells his brothers, and the brothers cover their father with a cloak without looking at him. Noah discovers what his son Ham did and curses Ham's son Canaan and not Ham. 2 things I want to pause and talk about here. First, why would a son accidentally seeing his father naked and then telling his siblings be that big of a deal? The actions of the brothers and Noah seem to reflect the prohibition on seeing the nakedness of relatives that appear in Leviticus chapter 18. Now that may or may not mean that the story was a direct copy or transposition of the Levitical law into the story. It may or may not have happened that way. It still could have been that it was an earlier story with that kind of rule appeared, and so the lawmakers decided it was a good idea and adopted it into Leviticus. Who knows? I think it is possible that this could be a sign of a later authorship, though, like this, again, the 6th or 7th centuries BC, around the time when Leviticus was being written. Second, it's interesting how Canaan is being cursed on account of what his father did, and not any of the other sons of Ham, and not Ham himself. Specifically, here is what Noah said: "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Now this is the same Canaan that is to be the ancestor of the Canaanites. In Genesis chapter 27 verse 46, Isaac's wife Rebekah mentions that she doesn't want Jacob marrying the daughters of the land, meaning the Canaanites, and that she's weary of them. Of course, this is partly a ruse to give Jacob an excuse to get away from Esau, because Esau is looking to kill him. But Isaac doesn't really question what she says. So I think this is a statement about the Canaanites reflected is a very real attitude which had developed among the early Israelites. Whether it was being cultivated on purpose as a smear campaign of sorts, or was a natural reaction to something the Canaanites did, is anybody's guess. I think that the difference in the genealogy, the Israelites being the descendants of Shem and the Canaanites being the descendants of Canaan, and that in Noah's curse may have been meant as an explanation for why the Israelites not only thought of themselves as different, but also better than their Canaanite brethren. Even the idea of having the patriarchs come from outside of Canaan may have been a purposeful way of getting the Israelites to think of themselves as different from the Canaanite natives, even though the people that would become the Israelites were themselves Canaanite. And I won't go into too much depth on that here, but I'll go into more depth with explanations why I believe this is so in my next video. Moving on. So we get into the generations of Noah's 3 sons, and then we meet an unsavory character named Nimrod, possibly the nickname of a real king of Babylon or Assyria. According to Genesis chapter 10 verse 9, he was a, quote, mighty hunter before the Lord. Verse 10 and 11 state that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And then out of that land went forth Ashur, possibly an early Assyrian king in the 21st century BC, and built Nineveh and the city Rehoboth, which may have been near Nineveh, and Calah, also known in the modern day as Nimrud, built by King Shalmaneser I during the 13th century BC. This king, Shalmaneser, conquered 8 countries and claimed to have blinded 14,400 enemy prisoners in one eye. I would not doubt if this king or his son named Tukulti-Ninurta I, who was also a conqueror, and later kings like King Sennacherib and King Nebuchadnezzar II were the inspiration for the biblical Nimrod. After the brief mention of Nimrod, we get more genealogies, and then in chapter 11 we are introduced to the Tower of Babel story. According to Genesis, quote, the whole earth was of one language, end quote. The people decide one day to make a city and a tall tower that reached to the heavens. God comes in and decides he is not pleased with what he sees. So he confuses the people's language, which causes them to scatter throughout the entire earth and abandon their building project. This could be a reference to an actual building project that had to be abandoned. No doubt the place where this could have occurred would have been in Babylonia. This is pretty safe to assume because both the name Babel and the passage where the story is mentioned places the people in Shinar, which is also another name for Babylonia. Also, this area is known for its temple towers, or ziggurats, which are stepped pyramidal towers that have reached several stories high. This also could have been simply a 5th century author's insult against the Babylonians that were holding him captive. On a side note, it's also interesting how God refers to himself in plural form, saying, quote, let us go down and there confound their language, end quote. This somewhat fits with the statement in the Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 where God says, quote, let us make man in our image, end quote. The very first chapter and part of the second chapter of Genesis is identified by modern scholars as coming from the priestly source, which was written around the 6th and 5th centuries BC. One final note concerning the genealogies from Genesis chapter 11 verses 10 through 32. which cover the genealogies, the second genealogy, because there's two genealogies of Shem, but the second one is where the ages of the men are mentioned. And the ages of all these men at which they supposedly died contradict with God's statement in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3.
Why are we here? And just what do we fear? Well, ce soir, for a change, it will all be made clear. For this is the meaning of life. C'est le sens de la vie. This is the